So let's see if we can be clear about this. What year is it? Really? That's what it said on the calendars that you got? 2023? 2020, well, see, 2023 is very ambiguous. We'll come back to the 5784. You're not wrong. I'm not saying you're wrong, but let's start with the 2023. Because be honest with me, when you are signing your checks, or rather reviewing the receipts that have already been done through AutoPay on your behalf, it doesn't say 5784 in the corner, does it? No, it says 2023. But 2,223 what? Years since what? Okay, so what is the usual, when we want to be formal, appendage? We put at the end what? AD, which means Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. Not my Lord, but whose Lord is it? The Christians, right? So very famously, the AD stands for Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, pointing back towards, well, kind of the year zero, which was sort of presumed to be the actual time when Jesus was born. It does seem by most historical accounts that that's not the date that he would have been born. We can talk about the issues with Christmas another time, but even the year does not seem to have been 2023 years ago. It's probably off by a little bit. But nonetheless, they've kind of been working with that and jimmying it so it would fit the calendar cycle for the last 2023 years. But what do we call the time before AD? Because, I mean, let's be honest, it only goes back 2023 years ago, and we know a lot of stuff happened before that, because like a lot of our stuff happened before that. BC, which stands for... I've always loved the fact that the BC is in a different language than the AD. I mean, come on. Can we get a little consistency here? It's almost as though BC was an afterthought. It's almost as though they only wanted to talk about the AD stuff because everything that was BC was just prologue. It didn't really matter. It was just build-up. It was only there to set the stage in order that we would have the AD timeline, which was the real timeline that mattered. Now, I may sound a little facetious in that, but I'm being deadly serious. That's why BC is of a very different style than AD, a different language completely, and it was done because the early Catholic Church and throughout the Middle Ages very much had the mindset that everything that was before an AD time was just preamble. It didn't really matter. It didn't really count. The only thing that counted was from when Jesus came until when he came back, which they're still looking for. So it's not surprising that the way they tell their story is labeled in that way, which is why we have been saved by modern academics. Modern academics are very uncomfortable. They squirm in their seats if they are forced to write AD and BC for the dates in their research papers. If a historian, if an archaeologist, if an anthropologist are writing about things in the past, they will almost never use AD and BC. Instead, what will they use? CE, standing for Common Era, and BCE, standing for... they saved us. It's all better now. What's the problem here? It's this. What makes this the Common Era exactly? Well, either you answer it's the Common Era because we're all Christian, and that's in common, or you answer it's the Common Era because that's the way the people who colonized much of the world and imprinted their own calendar system onto the globe counted. So they made it common, whether you liked it or not, at the other end of a musket. And so it became common to date the world calendars this way. And of course, BCE is before the Common Era, before we all got together on the same page with our gunships. Still problematic, isn't it? The story it's telling is still one of maybe not Christian domination, but then of European domination. Because the only way that calendar became common was through the militant acts of colonial aggression. Ones that we as Jews and we as people who came from a variety of different countries and ethnicities in this room were the victims of, and very rarely the beneficiaries of. So BCE and CE tell a different story, but it's still not a great story. It is still a story of erasure of all of the other calendars that existed in the rest of the world. But don't worry, modern academics have an alternative. I don't know if you've heard, but there is a moderately large movement pushing for what's known as the Holocene calendar. The Holocene calendar. Holocene. You know, like the Jurassic and Mesozoic and all of those eras in history, right? The Holocene calendar is the calendar that is meant to track from the beginning of substantial, permanent human settlement. Meaning, at the point when we began to build towns and villages and cities that were actually going to endure and not just be where we stopped following the herd of whatever herd we were following for this many months, but the actual building of places, which came with agriculture and civilization and culture as we now experience it. Well, that happened about 12,000 years ago, at least for the very earliest examples, some of which are in Turkey. Very interesting digs going on there. So, very cleverly, by our own retro review, if you add 10,000 to the current year, it works out to be about the best estimate of how long ago it was that human settlement globally began. This is something shared by all of humanity, even if it happened in one place, but it was something that was happening elsewhere. We just haven't dug those pieces up. And it is something that has been shared and spread across the globe. So this would now be the year 10,223. You see how neat that is? You just stick a 1 in front of our 2023. Thank you. Thank you. This is why I didn't become an accountant. No offense, Michael. Yes, 12,023. 12,023. See, it works perfect. It's easier to see on paper, which is where I do most of my counting, because in my head doesn't work. It's the same year, 2023, but with 10,000 added to it, so it becomes 12,023. And now we are no longer reflecting the issues of BCE or BC or AD or CE. Now we are using a truly universal human timeline. From the beginning of human culture and civilization that began to develop into a more permanent, stable, transmitted form that we now, well, sitting here in our own civilization, are definitely the beneficiaries of. And whether you are sitting here in Orlando, or whether you are in the middle of Africa, or whether you are in the middle of Asia, or in the middle of South America, all of us can trace much of our history in a non-confrontational, non-exploitative way back to this 12,000 year ago revolution that began to sweep across the globe. Universal. Great, right? Well, anybody here actually do history before 0 on the BCE, CE, or AD, BC scale? Anyone actually bother reading things that happened before 0? Because, come on, we're Jews. We should be, because a lot of our interesting stuff happened there. Right, so 586 BCE. Famous date? Destruction of the first temple. Well, okay, so I got to go back 2,023 years. That's fine. I get to the year 10,000 at 0. But now I got to go back 586 years subtracted out of 10,000. The problem for those that have actually learned history is we got used to those BC, CE, BCE numbers. And the Holocene calendar doesn't really work well with that. We got to learn a whole new set of numbers. Whether you are doing Jewish history, whether you're doing Roman history, whether you're doing any ancient history, it's a whole new set of numbers. And that's a little frustrating, especially for those of us that spend a lot of time before 0. But is it a worthwhile price to pay? Is it worth the effort of doing the math, of memorizing a few numbers in the 7, 8, 9,000 range to change our perspective? To get rid of the Anno Domini trademark, to get rid of the negative numbers. Because I'll tell you, when I work with children who have not yet been fully indoctrinated into the cult of negative years, the first time you tell a kid that the first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE, which was 586 years before zero, so when you want to figure out how long ago that was, you've got to add 586 to 2023. They look at you like you are speaking in tongues.
We can't even figure out the metric system.
Most of them haven't even begun to do negative numbers in elementary school, and now we're asking them to be able to look into negative history. It would be much more natural if we started with the kids, because old people have a harder time, working with straight numbers that began with 0, 12,000, and 12,023 years ago, and then work our way forward and just learn a set of numbers, and we'll be good. Yes? Well, you start with 0. So you start with 0. Yes. I know who you are. For those who don't know, this is my mother. So there's a different degree of banter allowed.
Because Egypt and the Indus Valley and the Asian Valley started in different times.
But they did. They actually started after the 12,023 years ago proposal. So they would still be in like the 3,000, 4,000, 6,000, 7,000 mark. Because when we talk 12,000 years ago, we're talking a long time ago. Even the pyramids had not yet been built. But you do still have the problem of 0. But what is this calendar trying to propose? It is saying that before 12,000 blah, 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 human civilization wasn't really a historical event. At that point, you're basically talking about Homo sapiens coming out of Africa, Neanderthals and Homo erectus and habilis and all of the other ones that are being continually described and discussed. There's no point in talking about a historical number for that at that point. At that point, we might as well talk about 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, and we don't need a precise date counting forward from the beginning of the dinosaurs. We don't need to know that in the year 4, Thomas T. Rex, ran for public office. You didn't vote for him? He was going to save them from extinction, but no one voted. So the idea is we only need precise numbers. We only need precise numbers when we are starting with history. And with history, basically, we're talking about settled communities. And therefore, yes, there is a before 0, but no one bothers to go into negative numbers in the Holocene calendar. It's based off human civilization, and that we should push back to about 12,000 years ago rather than giving all the credits to the Mesopotamians and the Indus and the Egyptians and the valleys in China and other places. You know what? Those people were still Johnny-come-latelys when we talk about the true scope of human civilization. Let's recognize how deep it goes, how long we as a civilization have been working. That's the argument for the Holocene. But I know that some of you are saying in the back of your mind, aren't we at the synagogue? Why are we talking about various arguments of historical, anthropological, archaeological calendars? Well, because what does this calendar do to the 5784 that we first started with? We're going to have to transpose differently if we want to translate one to the other. If we want to line up 5784 with this Holocene 10,000 plus calendar, it's going to be awkward. But I would argue easier than it would be if we were trying to line it up with the AD BC negative number nonsense. And I would also argue that it is easier for us to accommodate in our secular lives. You see, it's okay to have more than one way of tracking time. It's okay to have more than one story. The story of the Holocene calendar is a beautiful story. It's one that I do find very compelling, although I don't really put great odds on it succeeding. The idea that humanity should have a shared calendar that shows the deep antiquity of human culture and civilization, that doesn't make it sound like the only interesting things that have happened in human society happened in the last 2,000 years, but tell us that humans have been a going concern, have been working hard to overcome the challenges and difficulties of life, have been banding together to form complex societies and communities for more than 10,000 years. I find that inspiring, and I find that a universal message of humanity's great strength and our endurance, that we've put up with living together in complex societies for more than 10,000 years. And we haven't fallen apart, and if anything, we've gotten much better at it. But that doesn't mean there isn't also room for 5784. Some argue, oh, well, wait, it's 5784, that doesn't fit into the calendar, then clearly there were humans before that, then how do we do Adam and Chava in Bereshit that we're going to read about very soon in Simchat Torah? Well, we don't. We don't try and reconcile them. Because the story of Adam and Chava is not the story about what precisely happened 5,784 years ago. The story of Adam and Chava is there an element to human life that is more than stacking one brick on top of another? That is more than how did they decide who would get to shepherd where, and who would get to tax the grain, and what those taxes would pay for, and when did they decide to start sharpening bronze and sticking it in other people? 5784 tells us that's not the narrative that is most important to Jews. The narrative that is most important to Jews is what is the journey from the point where the soul awakened until this time. Not the material culture, not the political culture, not the agricultural culture, but the spiritual life of our people. How do we tell that story? Well, we tell that story by starting with the idea that all of humanity was created the same, from that same beginning, and that we were set apart, different from everything else in the world, not because of our physical constitution, which is dirt, just like everything else in the world, but by our spiritual constitution. That God breathed into that dirt and gave it a spiritual life. There was already plenty of other life, but we have a neshama, we have a soul. There is a nefesh, there is a ruach. So many different ways of speaking about the breath of life within us that makes our life have a layer of meaning, a layer of purpose, a layer of understanding, a layer of aspiration that is very different than the Holocene calendar, beautiful though it is. And talking about that calendar, the 5,784, keeping track of our time parallel to a different calendar, is a very powerful spiritual activity. We remind ourselves every day when we wake up and look at 2023 or 12,023 that we've got work to do. We've got to pay our taxes, we've got to get the car registration taken care of, we've got to send in a check by a certain date. It is a very concrete number that is widely shared and thus useful, and one that, with the right frame of mind, can reflect the wonderful endeavors of humankind. But it tells me nothing about my soul. When I see next to it 5,784, now I'm thinking about who am I really? I'm not just someone who pays taxes. I'm not just someone who registers my car. I'm not just someone who gets the bills in on time. Who am I beyond just the secular ticking of the clock, beyond just the inhuman measure of time, merely as the passing of our sun, our passing of our planet around the sun? And when we look at 5784 as a count, when we look at how Judaism has marked the events of our people, then we get that strength to pursue a different measure of our life. Which leads me to the calendar that all of us forget. Your calendar. There can be a calendar for humanity. There can be a calendar for Jews. But there also needs to be a calendar for me. How do I measure my time, my life? Because all of us, we've all got a zero. and no negative numbers before that. We've all got a 0. At some point we were born. And now we are X number of years into our journey. Unfortunately, the end of the calendar is very hard to read. We don't know what the last page will say. But we do know what the pages prior to this point have said. And do we simply look at them and say, oh, that happened? Do we simply tick them off as though we were a historian, saying the event A happened on date so and so? Or do we actually look at them as a proper historian, which doesn't merely catalog a run of events, and I am sorry if you've ever had a history teacher that made you think that's what history was, but instead catalogs the events as a chain that tells a story, that explains why things are the way they are, why they ended up in this position, who did what and when, and what were those results, and how did that affect the lives of the people that were touched by it. We each have our own story too. All of you. And it's a little different than everyone else around you, and that's not wrong. You don't have to worry about, well, when I tell my story, it's biased, it's prejudiced. Okay, it might be. You're the star of your story. You're the hero of your epic. Or at least you should be. But I do have to caution that you have to do at least a minimum of due diligence as a historian would do. Which is to say, no matter how much you like a particular character, like maybe yourself, you have to be honest. And no matter how much you dislike a particular character, including yourself, you have to be honest. When you are assessing the story that you have already written, when you are assessing who you are, go through carefully and make sure that you are actually properly attributing the amount of agency that you deserve. If you messed up royally because you did something stupid, something insulting, something offensive, something that could have easily been avoided, and you didn't avoid it, you did it anyway, full knowing what the consequences were going to be, don't call that a win. Don't tell yourself in the story, yeah, but I'm the hero, so I'll get out of it in the next act. And that means it's just all building the tension. No. Call it what it is. A mistake, a transgression, a sin. And if you do something right, if you did something right, don't say, oh, it wasn't a big deal. It was nothing. Anyone else would have done it too. Or, well, yes, I may have done that, but, you know, have you seen all the other bad things I did? How often do we tell that story to ourselves? Where we downplay the good that we do. We discount it. We sweep it aside. We excuse it as though somehow we're not really responsible for the good, even though we are supremely responsible for all of the bad in the world over which we had no control. That doesn't make you a very good historian. If someone was to say Abraham Lincoln caused the Civil War, or Abraham Lincoln resolved the Civil War, they would be a bad historian, because it's not that simple. You would have to write books, and they have, working out precisely how the Civil War began. Hint, slavery. And they would have to work out precisely how the Civil War finished. Badly. Those are the short versions. But we would want to investigate each and every person involved. What did they do? What could they have done? What should they have done? Judaism asks us to do that for our own story. Not just to pull us down from our arrogance, although we do often tend in that direction. Not just to tell us about mistakes that we've tried to forget, about errors that we wished we could overlook or that we've tried to play off as not being important or significant, but also the good stuff. All that stuff that we try to pretend doesn't really matter because it was me. Stuff that if a friend had done for you, you would be appreciative to your dying day. You will excuse that when you did for someone else as really being inconsequential. How often do you tell that story to yourself? How helpful is that story to yourself? When we tell the story using AD and BC, it sets up a kind of narrative. Like I said, BC becomes prelude. It becomes inconsequential. It is just something that happened before we got to the good stuff. When we use BCE and CE, again, whether we know it or not, we are implicitly buying into the idea that the people who had AD and BC were the ones who took over the world and forced everyone else to agree, and that we should go along with that. When we tell the story of the Holocene, with the idea of shared humanity's origins going back 12,000 years, the depth of human struggle, we tell a different story with a different feeling. When we say 5784, we say something different about the human soul and our condition. And when you tell your story to yourself, make sure you are telling the right story, the good story. But there is one little perk about telling the story to yourself. You can change it. All right, I can't go back and change what happened in the past. Trust me, I've tried. I love counterfactual history, and it's one of my favorite forms of fiction. But it doesn't work. I can reimagine everything at different points in human history and wonder how would things look differently. And it's fun. It's a nice fantasy. But what I can do is re-examine the events of my life, whether the big ones or whether just things I did yesterday, and try to honestly appraise what was good so that I can do more of that, and what was bad so I can fix it and then not do more of that. And so then I can have a better understanding of who I am and then draw it closer to who I want to be. You don't get that option when dealing with human history. Yes, we can work to be the change in the world that we want to see, absolutely. But we all know that it's going to take a few billion of us. You do what you can, of course. But don't imagine for 1 second that anyone here is the architect of human history. We do what we can to propel Jewish history forward, to share that story with our kids, to share that story with each other, to say what it means and what it means for this point in 2023, or 12,023. But again, we're not the sole architects of that story. But your story, your calendar, counting from your birth, you've got control over that. No, you can't go back and change the past, but you can change what the past means. You can take credit for the things that you deserve to take credit for, and you can have remorse for the things over which you should be remorseful. And by then acting accordingly, by continuing to multiply the good that you do, and by continuing to try and repair the damage that you've done, your story changes. You can fix the past. And you are the only one in charge of your future. But you have to see that it is your story. It is fascinating, as you can tell, I always geek out about these things, to count the different ways we can count human life and history. But ultimately, what's really important is we recognize that there is one calendar that matters more than any other. And it is unique, it is private, and you're the only one writing it. Make sure that you are writing it for good. Make sure that you realize your true potential, both to overcome your mistakes as well as to expand upon the goodness that you've already shown. That is the secret of the High Holidays, to see ourselves as the true architect of our own reality. Embrace it, enjoy it, celebrate it. Count each day. You count each day. Shana Tova.